Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome on behalf of the Maryland Sierra Club to this webinar on extended producer responsibility for packaging and paper products. I'm Martha Ainsworth, Chair of the Maryland Sierra Club Zero Waste Team, and I will be your moderator this afternoon. At this webinar, you'll learn about the objective of extended producer responsibility and the kinds of products typically covered, how EPR packaging works, and the key program components, where EPR for packaging is practiced in the world, it's the effectiveness of these programs and where they're under consideration in the United States. We're so pleased that you can join us this afternoon, and I want to extend a special welcome to several public officials, Delegate Regina Boyce, Delegate Jerry Clark, Delegate Robin Lewis, Delegate Sarah Love, Delegate Johnny Motz, Delegate Pam Queen, Delegate Sheila Ruth, and Delegate Jen Terrassa. Thank you for joining us. I'd also like to acknowledge Director of the Department of Environmental Protection in Montgomery County, Adam Ortiz, and Councilman Kai Hagan from Frederick County. Welcome, everyone, and welcome to all the rest of you, and Happy New Year. Before introducing our speakers, I'd like to go over a few logistical issues. Because of the large number of attendees, all of you will be muted during the presentation and questions will be taken at the end. You don't have to wait until the end of the presentation, however, to type a question using the Q&A function on your screen. Please put your questions in the Q&A function, and you can put anything else you want in the chat. At the end of the presentation, we'll read off your questions in order. If you're an elected official, please send a message to Gary Young in the chat, and I will invite you to make your to ask your question yourself. So I'm very pleased to introduce you now our guest speaker, John Hite. John is a policy analyst with the Zero Waste Project at the Conservation Law Foundation. CLF is a nonprofit member-supported regional environmental organization working to conserve natural resources, protect public health, and promote thriving communities in the New England region. Its Zero Waste Project aims to protect the region's communities from the dangers posed by landfills and incinerators, to support the development of a circular economy, and reduce unsafe and unsustainable plastic use and waste disposal. Over the past 2 years, John has collaborated with legislators, advocates, and municipal leaders in Maine and Massachusetts to develop and advance extended producer responsibility laws for packaging. In particular, in coalition with partners like the Natural Resources Council of Maine, John and CLF have aided Maine legislators, the Maine Department of Environmental Protection, local municipalities, and industry representatives in crafting a first of its kind EPR proposal for Maine, which drew national attention as the furthest advanced EPR for packaging legislation in the country. Following John's presentation, we'll invite Delegate Brooke Lierman to preview legislation she's sponsoring in the 2021 General Assembly session on this issue. Brooke is in her second term in the Maryland House of Delegates, representing Maryland's 46th legislative district in the city of Baltimore. She currently serves on the House Environment and Transportation Committee, where she's the chair of the Land Use and Ethics Subcommittee. She's an environmental champion, and we're very excited to have her here today to tell us all about her bill. So at this point, I'd like to invite John to launch his presentation.
Sounds good. Let me just do a quick screen share here. And there we are. First off, thanks so much, Martha and Gary, for hosting and for having me on. It's a pleasure to be back. I always enjoy zooming down to Maryland. It's been, I think this is my third time since the pandemic started that I've been able to come down to Maryland, which would not have been something that was possible in the before times. And it's a pleasure to present as well with Delegate Lierman again. It's great to be back. Thanks, Martha, for the great introduction. I won't go over any more of my bio then. but I will just sort of give a quick roadmap for what I'm going to be presenting about today. I'm going to try and keep this to like 20 to 25 minutes. We'll see how well that goes. We want to leave a healthy amount of time for question and answer, as I think that's usually when a lot of the best discussions around some of these complex topics come out. So I may rush through a couple slides. If I do, please forgive me. And if anybody needs more clarification on a specific section, feel free to bring that up in the Q&A and I'll make sure to go back over it. So I hope to make two things clear today through my presentation. The first is what is extended producer responsibility, to give you all a sense of how these bills operate, what they do. When we're talking about EPR for packaging, what are we talking about, which will hopefully give Delegate Lierman then a platform to be able to talk specifically about what has been proposed in Maryland. But before I go into what is EPR for packaging, I do need to start with, I think it's important to start with the why. Why are we having this conversation right now? EPR for packaging isn't a new topic. In the United States, people have been discussing it and putting forward proposals for about 3 decades now. But right now, there's a resurgence, a real resurgence in conversations around this important policy. So I'm hoping to cue that up just a little bit. And as I go through, I will be speaking about extended producer responsibility using the acronym EPR. Our comms department hates acronyms. I apologize for that. There will be 2 acronyms I'll ask you to hold on to. One is EPR. This policy is also known as product stewardship or producer responsibility for short. It's all the same thing. So if you hear EPR, that's what we're talking about. So the most recent iteration of this conversation about EPR has come up in the context of what's now being called the recycling crisis. Reporters love a crisis. So recycling crisis took off as the term of art about 2 years ago. The difficulties with our recycling system have their start in 2 parallel trends that began over the past few decades. The first is a trend towards cheap, difficult to recycle materials that have been used in packaging. So when I'm talking about that, I'm talking specifically about plastics or multi-material packaging. And I think plastics are sort of at the crux of this problem. There's, we only recycle about 13% of our plastics in the US. And only about 9% of plastics globally get recycled. Now, you might think that that is an issue of collection. We just need to collect more recycling. If we could collect more plastic, then we could manage more of it. But that's not exactly true, mainly because of market dynamics. If you think through the life cycle of recycling plastics, it needs to be collected, it needs to be sorted, then it needs to be processed and turned back into something that can be used in packaging again. All of that process costs money and costs time and raises the price of recycling. So when a packaging company looks around for new material, they're going to look on the market. They might see, a pound of #1 PET plastic that's being sold for 15 cents a pound. And then they compare that with the price of virgin plastic that'll be 2 to 3 cents a pound. And so unless you're really willing to fall on your sword for sustainability as a business, the choice is very easy. You're going to choose virgin plastic every time. So this makes recycling difficult. On the other side, the other trend is a trend towards single stream recycling. This is also called curbside recycling. It's the blue bin you see in the picture there that I'm sure many of you are familiar with in your homes and offices. Everything goes into one bin. It's whisked off to a facility. It's sorted apart through a magic process. If you haven't ever seen a video of one of these materials recycling facilities in operation, definitely look them up. They're fascinating and ingenious. But unfortunately, single stream recycling isn't magic. And the downside of the efficiency and the volume that you collect when you throw everything in one bin is that your material value degrades. If you throw a glass bottle into a bin, it might smash. In fact, it's likely to smash. And you might wind up with shards of glass in your cardboard, or you might wind up with bits of one type of plastic in bales of another type of plastic. That's called contamination. And the contamination makes recycling much more difficult. It lowers the value of that material on the market. So we have these 2 converging trends. On the one hand, we have cheap, difficult to recycle materials, and then that is compounded by single stream recycling that further degrades the value of our recycled material. We got away with this system for about a decade and a half, 2 decades, by shipping a decent amount of our material, our recycled material, overseas. Not all, but enough. A significant amount of our recycled material was going to China, it was going to Thailand, it was going to India, but principally China. And they would take out what they could, and the rest would wind up in either a Chinese landfill or an incinerator. In 2018, the Chinese government said, no more, we're done, we're not going to be the world's dumping ground anymore. And they closed their borders to most imports of foreign recyclables. Those costs then, the cost of managing recyclables and not having a viable market for a decent amount of our difficult to recycle material, has kicked back to US haulers, who have then passed it along to US towns and cities and counties, who are largely responsible for managing recycling and waste. Now, I don't have data from Maryland. Perhaps Delegate Lierman can speak to this a bit when she is presenting, but I've got some anecdotal evidence here from New England. And as you can see, we're not talking about a 15 or 20 or 25% increase in recycling costs. We are talking about a wholesale exponential increase in recycling costs. Just looking at, some of these cities in Connecticut, Bridgeport and Stamford, both went from tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars in bonuses, in revenue that they would make from recycled material, to hundreds of thousands of dollars in costs that they're now paying. Excuse me, this has been so burdensome, in fact, that some municipalities like Goldsboro, Maine, have decided to cancel their recycling service, if not just for the time being, potentially forever. So this is a real intense burden that we've got. Now, I'm sure that you're all thinking, or I would imagine that you're thinking, if we're about to talk about EPR for packaging, that EPR for packaging is the answer and the solution to this problem that I just laid out, this problem of cheap materials, single stream recycling that increases contamination, and then now this compounded cost on local government. I want to make it very clear at the outset, and I'll say this again throughout, EPR for packaging, although it is an important, critical cornerstone of a way towards a sustainable recycling future, EPR for packaging is not a silver bullet solution. I don't want us to hang our hats fully on EPR and forget other important policies like foam bans and bag bans that Maryland passed in the past couple sessions, things like minimum recycled content standards for new packaging, making sure that we're requiring 10 or 15 or 20% of recycled content in all new packaging. Things like bottle bills that increase the collection, provide an incentive for consumers to bring back their beverage containers, provide a clean source of material, and also help deal with litter. There's a whole suite of potential policies that can help us move forward. But at the base, EPR does help shift around some of these economic incentives that might otherwise make recycling less efficient. So what is extended producer responsibility? What is EPR? In a theoretical sense, EPR is about an extension of the polluter pays principle. So currently, our waste costs are subsidized or are foisted onto the public sector. Waste management grew out of public health concerns in the early 1900s. That was when it was mostly, manure and organic waste in the streets. So towns and cities would send somebody out to scoop that up and dump it in a landfill outside of town. But our waste stream has gotten much more complex and much more branded and much more difficult to manage. But municipalities, towns, cities, and counties still maintain their role of dealing with that waste. And they've done largely the best they can. I can't fault municipalities here really at all. However, municipalities don't have any real control over what comes into their communities. And they don't have any control over how that's designed. And they certainly don't have any control over end markets where that material is being sold. However, haulers and producers of that packaging do have control over those other elements. So extended producer responsibility is about handing those waste costs and handing management of the after consumer life of materials back to the folks who are making it in the first place. This is not a new concept here in the United States. We have 118 programs in 33 states for a number of different products, including batteries, mercury, auto switches, electronics, and paint. We, however, do not yet have a single law for packaging, EPR for packaging. So I'm going to walk through, now that you've got a bit of a sense of the problem and theoretically what EPR hopes to accomplish, I'm going to walk through what we mean when we talk about EPR for packaging specifically. A great place to start is, what do we mean by packaging? Well, packaging really can be as broad or as thin as the definition in the legislation as you'd like, but generally speaking, it's a rather broad definition that includes most consumer packaging, and it includes everything that would go in your curbside recycling bin, and it includes a lot of stuff that isn't included in your curbside recycling bin. Part of the idea of EPR for packaging isn't just about targeting materials that can be recycled. It's about targeting the entire packaging waste stream to provide an incentive for producers to think through what they're putting on the market. If their packaging can't in fact be recycled, well, then maybe they need to pay a little bit more into the system. Maybe they need to figure out a different way to design their packaging so that it can in fact be recycled and doesn't wind up in a landfill or an incinerator. Another important thing that we need to think through when we're talking about EPR for packaging is who. Who are we talking about? When we say producers, extended producer responsibility, who do we mean? Now, I put these labels up not to single out these companies, although I have inadvertently done so, but more just to speak to the scale of EPR. When we're talking about EPR for packaging, we're not talking about your mom and pop shop on Main Street. We're talking about big multi-billion-dollar international companies. We're talking about General Mills, Amazon, Procter & Gamble, Unilever, Mondelez, these massive companies that sell packaging in every country or most countries in the world. Every EPR proposal for packaging in the United States that I have seen, and most EPR proposals or EPR laws for packaging in other countries, include exemptions for small businesses. The number one question I get is, isn't this going to be a burden on small business? It won't be, because we exempt small businesses. In Maine, any producer or any producer rather, generating less than 1 ton of packaging every year and making less than $2 million in revenue is exempt from the program. If you make less than $2 million in revenue a year, you owe nothing into the program. And even for, I've seen a lot of proposals as well, and we've been trying to push this in New England for small generators. So anyone who's making from 1 ton to 15 tons of packaging can pay a flat fee not based on how much packaging they're selling into the system, but sort of a general estimate, if you will. This has been tried and true in British Columbia, who's had an EPR for packaging program for a number of years. The highest flat fee margin for producers of anywhere between 12 and 15 tons per year, I believe, is just north of $3,000. So is that nothing? No, it's not nothing. It's certainly something that these businesses are contributing, but is it enough to really burden a company that's likely making tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars? It's not a ton. It's not a ton. And that concept gets grown even more when we're talking about these big companies. And these big companies really are who is going to be shouldering the majority of the burden. Quebec has 3,400 different producers involved in their EPR for packaging program, 3,400. Only 150 companies of those 3,400 generate 80% of all the packaging. So think about that, 3,400 in total, 150 generate 80% of all the packaging. So it really is pretty focused on these larger companies. So in terms of the nuts and bolts of how these programs operate, all EPR programs follow a similar rough framework. I'm going to walk through this very quickly, but hold on to this diagram in particular for when Delegate Lierman shares about Maryland's, because you'll see all of these same elements cropping up as she's working through explaining how Maryland's bill will work. At the core of an EPR program, we have a producer responsibility organization. We've now come to my second acronym. Apologies again. EPR is one. The PRO, Producer Responsibility Organization, is the other. All EPR legislation, or most EPR legislation, I should say, requires producers to do take back of their product, to do take back and then recycling or disposal of their product. For some producers, producers could go off on their own and do their own take back. If we're talking about a batteries program, Duracell and Energizer and Everready could all set up their own box outside of a Best Buy or a Stop and Shop or wherever. And you'd have a Duracell box next to an Energizer box next to an Everready box. And when customers bought those particular types of batteries, when they finished their useful life, consumers would have to bring them back and drop the right battery in the right box. Well, as you can imagine, that's a pain for customers, and it's also a pain for producers. No producer wants to do that on their own. So they create economies of scale. And every EPR bill in existence allows producers to form a producer responsibility organization. This is a central clearinghouse or repository or a central repository, a group that takes fees. Producers pay fees to the producer responsibility organization. They pay membership fees, and the PRO then takes over management of the program. And producers are able to wash their hands of any further involvement. They pay their dues, they step. We're talking about batteries, rather than having a Duracell box and an Energizer box and an Everready box, we might be able to have just one battery collection box that is placed by the PRO for batteries in a particular state. The PRO then manages the recycling or disposal of those batteries. The first step that the PRO takes is to submit a plan in line with the legislation to the oversight agency. In Maryland, that might be the Maryland Department of Environment. In Massachusetts, it would be the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection. At the federal level, it might be the EPA. Whoever that oversight agency is, either at the state or the federal level, the PRO first submits a plan for how they're going to manage this program to the agency. The agency then either gives it an approval or a disapproval. If they approve the plan, then the PRO goes about implementing it, as I just explained. The PRO then, rather than producers, is who does interaction with municipal government or with private companies like Best Buy or like Stop and Shop, or with recyclers. It's the PRO that is that central repository. If whoever is working on the EPR bill or writing an EPR bill is using words like product stewardship, this organization might be known as the Product Stewardship Organization. Again, same exact thing, just different terminology. The term of art that I have come to use is PRO, but just keep an eye out for that. So now that you have a general understanding of the framework of how EPR bills function, with the PRO at the center collecting funds from producers and then managing oversight of the program, there's two general archetypes of how EPR for packaging programs function. The first is what the industry calls full producer responsibility, or what I've been saying is producer managed, which I think is a little bit more straightforward term. In producer managed systems, the producers get together, form a PRO. The PRO collects funds from the producers, submits a plan to the agency, whoever's doing oversight and enforcement. That plan is either approved or denied, as I explained. And then the producer responsibility organization goes about operating the entire program. So if we're talking about EPR for packaging, that means the PRO is heading out and reorganizing contracts. They're figuring out who is the best person, who's the best company to do collection in a certain area. They're doing lots of deep involvement with municipalities. They're helping municipalities with education. They're helping municipalities with litter. They're really involved and organizing and running the whole show. Now, that is contrasted then with the other version, the other archetype of EPR for packaging, which is known as shared EPR, or as I like to call it, municipal reimbursement. It's pretty self-explanatory in the title. Same first few steps. You have producers get together, form a PRO. PRO submits a plan to the agency. Agency either approves or denies. However, instead of having the PRO run the entire program, the PRO simply calculates or accepts calculations from local governments or private haulers for their recycling costs and reimburses them for those costs. So two different ways of doing this. There's lots of details that are added or taken away within these two archetypes, but generally speaking, these are the two different types of EPR for packaging. As you can imagine, there's lots of trade-offs here. Benefits of a producer-managed system Greater efficiency, absolutely. Economies of scale. Producers are able to see up and down the value chain. They're able to have more control over who's who and where and who's doing collection and how much collection they're doing. However, a drawback is that there's a lot of reorganization that happens very quickly within the waste system. And this can make it difficult for the agency to do oversight and enforcement. This is a particular concern that CLF has had, looking at an oversight agency like the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection. They do excellent work, but there's only 8 of them. And to imagine that DEP in Massachusetts could hire 3 or 4 or 5 new folks to staff this new program and get up to speed and be experts on EPR fast enough to keep track with the wholesale reorganization of the waste system, I leave that up to your judgment. The municipal reimbursement model is less disruptive, and that's has benefits. It maintains control at the local level, which also is appreciated by municipal governments often, although some municipal governments are ready to hand over full control. However, a drawback is it's often a much smaller scale. So when we're talking about reimbursement models, we're usually just talking about residential recycling. We're not talking about all recycling. In Massachusetts, that's 40, 45, 50% of recycling, depending on the year. Now, that doesn't mean that commercial recycling isn't recycled. It just means that it's not something that's reimbursed. So I've covered mostly just financial discussions, and EPR at its core is about realigning costs. By handing costs back to producers, we're hoping to give them control over the purse, so we get more money flowing into recycling programs, and that's obviously beneficial. And also to send a strong market signal to producers, that producers who are making products and packaging that can easily be recycled, their costs are less. Producers who are making packaging that is not easily recycled through the system are going to be paying more. So it's a strong financial incentive on producers to think through the life cycle of their products, not just the use value in terms of what goes on the shelf. I recognize I'm running a little bit behind on time here, so I'll hope to speed through these last 3 slides. I don't want to give you all a sense that this slide here is a throwaway slide. It's certainly not. When we're talking about EPR, we're not just talking about finances. We're also talking about a lot of other important recycling and environmental considerations. Right at the bottom of the list there, performance standards are critical for a well-functioning EPR program. I know Maryland's proposal has performance standards in it, requiring that the PRO or the producers through the PRO take back, 65% of packaging by 2027, 80% by 2030, and 95% by 2035. This provides legislators and the oversight agency with the ability to hold the PRO to account, to manage well a particular amount of material. That second bullet, eco-modulation, this is potentially a good one for the Q&A session because I could probably spend an hour alone just talking about eco-modulation. But simply put, most proposals now for EPR for packaging include what's called eco-modulation. These are slight manipulations of the fees that producers pay per ton of packaging, taking into mind environmental and recyclability factors. So if a producer is using lots of material that is easily recycled, say cardboard or number 1 PET that doesn't have a shrink wrap label. If that material can flow through the recycling system well and have value, great. Your fees are going to be smaller. However, if you're a producer who's using cartons or lots of multi-material packaging that cannot be recycled easily or costs a lot of money to recycle, guess what? Your costs are going to be up. It's a fairness consideration. It really is not fair if we're foisting outsized amounts of program costs onto producers who are making highly recyclable packaging. You should be celebrated and given credit for that as opposed to penalized. Last two slides very, very quickly before I hand it over to Delegate Lierman. EPR for packaging is not new in the rest of the world, even if it's new in terms of the number of proposals here in the United States. I believe it's somewhere around 45 jurisdictions worldwide have EPR for packaging programs. For the legislators on the line, keep that in mind when representatives of some of these producers do show up and tell you that we can't do it here. They do it pretty much everywhere else in the world. So the idea that they can't do it here is not really honest. Just keep that in mind. It's totally something that we could do here as it's done in Canada, Brazil, Russia, every EU country, and many, many others. To the very last slide, which I think is arguably the most important one, how effective and therefore how costly and then how effective are these programs in terms of cost? The number one question I get is, isn't this going to be a burden on small business? The number two question that I get is, isn't this just going to wind up with costs passed along to consumers? The answer overwhelmingly is no. Study after study has shown that product costs in jurisdictions with EPR for packaging are not noticeably higher than product costs for packaging in jurisdictions with EP or without EPR. Yeah, I got that right. So first off, costs are not passed through to consumers. Secondly, these programs are not really an overwhelming burden in terms of per capita costs, more of an overwhelming burden than our current system. If we could sit for 5 minutes on this slide, I'd have folks read through the entire thing, but I'm just going to bring your attention first to the third slide and then to the last. The third slide is Quebec. I've been fortunate enough to work closely with representatives from the Quebec PRO. Their program's been around for 15 years. It's fantastic, serves 8.3 million people. It is, in fact, a reimbursement style program. And I just want to bring you to that third column, net cost to producers. The program in actuality costs about $200 to $250 million each year to operate. The 151 net cost to producers is a little lower because of revenue from material that is sold on the market. $151 million might sound like a fair bit. Remember, I said 80% of all packaging is managed by 150 companies. There's 3,400 companies total that participate. But when you compare that $151 million to the net sales revenue from all the packaging that is sold in Quebec, that number is $110 billion. So $151 million in net cost to producers measured against $110 billion in the net sales from all of the products that are sold in that packaging. So we're really comparing two very different numbers here. And then just quickly glance at that bottom line. I don't have data on Maryland, as I said, and I have not imported data on Maine into this slideshow, but you'll notice the annual per capita costs for the program in Maine and the program in Quebec are almost the same. At the high end in Maine, the program costs about $13 per capita. All of that is taxpayer money. None of it is from producers, and Maine has a 36% recycling rate. That's actually high for the US. The average recycling rate in the US is 25% on average. Compare that to Quebec's. They've got a 63% recycling rate. That's twice as much material is being recycled in Quebec for the same cost per capita. And none of it is taxpayer, and it's managed more efficiently by a producer responsibility organization. So that's the overview of EPR for packaging and some of the problems, why that's being addressed. And I'm happy to take questions after Delegate Lierman shares about Maryland's proposal.
Great, thank you so much. Great to be here with all of you. Thanks, John, for that really excellent overview. I think most people want the slides too, so hopefully you'll send out the slides. I saw a couple of questions about the slides. My slides aren't nearly as fancy, but it's wonderful to be with all of you today. I want to start off just by saying that, I was really proud to work as part of a work group this interim with a number of the folks who are on the call today, the work group on waste reduction and recycling. And as part of that work group, we sent out a survey to every local government in the state, asking them, how is going? How's recycling going? Are you composting? How much is it costing you? what are your ideas to help with our recycling and with waste reduction? And the idea for EPR actually came from them. It came from our local governments who wrote in, who said our recycling costs are going up. We need alternative methods for dealing with this issue and with our recycling issues. You know, in addition to Delegate Boyce's awesome paint care bill, and people also, you know, of course, we all support Delegate Love's bottle bill, that there's a whole other group, you know, a whole other category of packaging or of waste that is increasing, not decreasing, and that's all of this packaging. I mean, every time I go to the grocery store, I feel like there's some new fancy packaging for the lettuce that I want to buy, right? I can't just buy a head of lettuce anymore. I have to buy lettuce either in a plastic bag or in a hard shell container. Every day there's some sort of like new plastic packaging that's being created to protect our products that end up in our landfills and that you and I are paying for through our local taxes to deal with. So could you guys share my slides? I think you have them. I don't think I can share them. Great. So I'm just going to go through the bill that we'll be bringing this year, and it's certainly a work in progress. This is a somewhat, you know, it's not new in that it exists all over the world, but it is a new bill in Maryland. But I will also add that it is not even, I mean, it's new in Maryland, but it's not, because we've had, you know, we have the paint care bill and we have other producer responsibility type systems as well. This is just producer responsibility for packaging and containers. So next slide. So the first thing I'll go over, the bill simply covers, and I am going to try to not be repetitive of things that John said, so I'm going to try to keep it specifically to the legislation that we're bringing. The covered products, it's really, this is about packaging and containers, consumer products, service packaging, medicine bottles, paper products, except for bound books. Next slide. And it defines producer. So a producer is somebody who manufactures, sells, distributes, or imports the covered product, those products we just talked about, under its own name or brand in Maryland, or imports a covered product as a licensee or franchisee who sells or distributes in Maryland. There's also an exception in the bill that we don't have a slide on for small producers. So making sure that we are really getting to the big guys that are really doing most of the work, as John said, and making most of the packaging and bringing most of it in to the state. Next slide. Also, we define product stewardship organization. We just call it a stewardship organization. Why not just, you know, simplify? It's just a sort of stewardship organization. This is the PRO that John was talking about. It's a nonprofit organization created by a group of producers to implement the stewardship plan. And the plan is the plan that's developed by those organizations to address the covered products and materials. Next slide. Okay, so the main points about the bill are that this is about waste reduction, and it's also about producers helping local governments cover costs associated with managing residential waste and recycling. I think we all know that our local governments are really hurting right now, and it is going to be like that for some time to come. When I said to our DPW, Department of Public Works, head of solid waste, you know, whenever I talk to him, he's just always trying to think creatively about how to come up with new solutions to deal with waste and recycling, because they just don't have the money that they need to do what they want to do. I mean, they're sort of barely skating by right now, let alone having dollars to innovate or to come up with new ideas to recycle more efficiently, to recycle more products. Right? There's just no money to do any of that right now. So that is just we have to keep in mind that has to be a goal, and that this is a shared responsibility. It should be. Right now, it's not a shared responsibility. It's all on us as taxpayers and on our local governments, but it should be more of a shared responsibility for dealing with these products that we use, but companies make. So the process in the bill is just producers will work together to create a stewardship organization, and they submit a stewardship plan to MDE. Next slide. So I will also say this bill is much less prescriptive than some of the other bills that exist around the country. It takes a less prescriptive approach to how the PRO will operate, which brings producers to the table. And it also, all the plans that the PROs submit are subject to MDE review, input, and approval. So we're trying to say, okay, PRO, here are some goals that you need to hit and a few outlines and a few guideposts, but you need to come up with a plan and then share it with MDE, and we'll tell you if it works or not. And I think that's important because in Maryland, I mean, one of the bills that we looked at, or a different bill around the country, was like 40 pages. And it was like, we don't pass 40-page bills in the Maryland General Assembly, right? This needs to be simple. And I think that's important too, because we have the statute, but then we also can put in regs, right? COMAR will help provide more direction. And then at the end of the day, it's the plan that's created and that MDE approves that will really guide things as well. So the stewardship components of the stewardship plan include the membership, so all the producers and brands that will be covered, the performance goals, post-consumer recycled material content rates, like that, increasing the post-consumer recycled material content is so important, as John mentioned, and we want to make sure that that's one of the goals, is increasing that. The percentage of products readily recyclable or compostable, increasing that. Implementation plan, the PRO will have to describe how these goals are going to be met or exceeded, and stakeholder engagement, how stakeholders, including local governments, recyclers, haulers, the general public, how they were engaged in the development of the stewardship plan, as well in creating it. So that's part. Next slide. Additional components include staffing, how the staffing and administration of the plan will be handled, product design. This is a big issue. We're going to ask them to look at how producers are going to work together to reduce packaging needs through better product design that's more thoughtful, that will lead to materials that can actually be recycled and not just end up in landfills, and a plan for public outreach and communication. We want to make sure that this comes up a lot. It came up during the plastic bag ban discussion last year. We've got to educate the public. We've got to educate the public. Yes, we absolutely have to educate the public on what is recyclable, how to recycle properly, how to prevent litter. And so making sure that that's a piece of this as well. And then finally, methods of financing. The PRO will have to create a fee structure for the members to cover the cost of implementation, administration, and reimbursing local governments. And we want to make sure in this fee structure that there are incentives, right? Not every producer is created equally. So there have to be incentives to encourage producers to decrease their waste and increase the recyclability of all of their products. Next slide. Accountability. So making sure that this actually happens and goes into effect is important if we pass this bill. So there will be reporting requirements for the PRO. Producers will submit their reporting to MDE. There'll be a public website where people can track it. And the sort of just the hammer is that there will be a prohibition to sell, import, or distribute on producers if they're not part of a product stewardship organization, or they're independently submitting a product stewardship plan for their products. So the idea is that is the hook, right? You can't sell, import, or distribute here unless you're part of this. And then there will be sort of minimal civil penalties, and the financing of it will be subject to audits. So that's it in a nutshell. That's the bill. So as you can tell, I'm not sure if it was entirely obvious from these slides, but we're not taking the model of the producers will run everything. We're taking the model of the plan local governments will continue to run all of our waste and our recycling. And we want the producers to create a plan where they will help reimburse us for that work, and work with local governments and MDE to provide funding for it. So hopefully that was quick enough, and we have time for some questions. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, both John and Delegate Lierman. That's a lot to take in, and I want to reassure everyone that this video and the presentations will be available. This is being recorded. I'd like to start with a couple questions here in the Q&A. This could be addressed to both of you. Is the destination of the packaging at the end of the process included in the EPR legislation?
Sorry, I was answering another question in the chat, typing
I
that.
can
say it again. Okay, you want to jump in?
Well, I can jump in and start. I mean, Delegate Lierman, if you want to share specifically about Maryland's legislation. Generally speaking, the destination of where material goes is not prescribed. That's up to haulers and MRFs to figure out. An important element of EPR bills, though, is that information is reported to the department. Oftentimes there are discretionary statutes or discretionary provisions in the legislation that requires that DEP keep any discretionary information given to the department in terms of where material is sold private, out of public eye. However, the haulers need to report that information to DEP so they can do proper oversight. The importance that's sort of these, the bowling rails, if you will, that keep producers making sure that their material is going towards genuine recycling and not being sent to things like chemical recycling, is the definition itself of recycling. So in the definition section of all of these proposals, there's a definition of recycling that explains clearly what the statute means. When the statute says that producers through the PRO are required to recycle a certain amount of material, whether that's the performance standard of 65% or 80% or whatever, that material has to be recycled in line with the definition, which makes sure that that material is going to proper useful end markets.
Brooke, do you have
I don't
anything?
have anything to add.
Okay. Okay. Another question I guess we can address to John is, has EPR resulted in significant changes in how packaging is designed? And if so, could you give us some examples?
That's a really good question. I mean, obviously at the core of EPR is this hope that by handing costs back to producers and creating incentive and an incentive structure, we're able to get producers to think more about their packaging and therefore improve the design end. I mean, I think that is, to me, what EPR should be built around, because for so long the conversation in the waste world has been, how do we manage all of this material? Well, I think it's about time we start asking, why are we managing all of this material in the first place? What if we were using and managing different material, or better yet, less material? If companies are able to move towards reuse instead of single use or recyclable packaging, that is obviously more beneficial than material that's even easily recyclable. Reuse, uses less energy than to do recycling, by and large, when you look at the full life cycle, including toxicity of these materials. So in terms of, I lost part of the question there. Hold on. Martha, would you mind just rereading the question to make
whether you've seen examples of them redesigning products.
Right. Got a little ahead of myself. Yes. So in terms of where these eco-modulated fees or these incentive structures may have started to change product design, eco-modulation really was implemented in Europe over the past decade at best. France is a leader in this area and has had about 7 years of experience. They have started to see producers shift their designs. Is it wholesale change in what they're putting on the market? No, but it is design changes that make products easier to recycle, which is the point. And France, Italy, now all EU countries are going to be required to do eco-modulation, and Canada is following suit. I know that these various producer responsibility organizations, the PROs, and the governments in those countries are intent on ratcheting down those eco-modulated fees. So if we've started to see some change, they're going to keep going with that and keep making these incentives stronger and stronger to help companies move in a better direction. But yes, there is movement.
Can I just add that I think the EPR, how much movement there is towards redesign is dependent on what the goals of the plan are. So if you are requiring, and how the fee structure is created. So if you're incentivizing, product design that leads to more recyclability or more reusability, and producers have to pay less fees or smaller amounts of fees or less money if they have those products, then they will be incentivized to do that. And so some of this is really just dependent on what the plan looks like and the incentives and the fee structure. And that I think that changes from country to country and changes, from province from province in Canada. And we'll see in the United States, I know there are going to be bills in multiple states introduced this year on EPR for packaging. And I think they're all slightly different.
Thank you. We have a related question. Is it possible that a loophole could occur for products that are delivered through interstate commerce, like by mail delivery? Would this affect that packaging that comes to your doorstep? Either of you.
Quick answer, no. If it's worded correctly. So the legislation that we've been working on in Massachusetts and Maine specifically includes e-commerce, out-of-state e-commerce. So any Amazon packaging that's shipped into Massachusetts would be required to be covered under the program. I believe from the brief reading I did of Maryland's bill that it also includes e-commerce.
Yes, yeah, no, ours is the purpose at least, and I'm be curious to see look at the language in Massachusetts and Maine and see if it's the same. But the purpose is to cover e-commerce as well.
Okay, I'd like to invite any delegates that have questions. I can't see you all, but if you want to activate your videos and go one at a time, we can take those questions.
Or comments.
Or comments. If there's anybody. Okay, well, I'm going to go on with, since nobody's jumped in, what roles would or should distributors and retailers have in EPR?
I'm happy to lead off,
Sure.
At least in theory generally. Retailers and distributors would play an important role in EPR. First and foremost, the EPR definition of producer is the producer themselves, the brand owner or manufacturer. However, the first importer is sort of the second tier there. So that would include retailers. Retailers, in theory, could pass along the cost of participating in the program to the producer if they're importing from out of state. Often they don't, and they won't. In Quebec, for instance, I believe just short of half of all producers are retailers. But again, there's 3,400 producers in total. And so some of those retailers may be on the smaller end. It's hard to, I haven't disaggregated the data yet to know exactly what size all of the different retailers versus producers are. But yeah, just under half are retailers in terms of the total number.
Delegate Lierman, anything to add?
No, I mean, I don't think there's anything to add to that. Thanks.
Okay. There's a question here as to whether any of the manufacturers in the Quebec program are US-based companies.
That's a great question. I saw that in the Q&A chat as well. I guarantee you there are. I would have to dig through and figure out which are. But I almost assuredly can guarantee you that there are US companies in that program. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, US companies are participating in EPR programs in other parts of the world. This is not a foreign concept to them. And so I guess, that leads, I think, a little bit to that Ameripen and the Flexible, Products or Packaging Institute. Those are the entities that represent all the producers, and they are very much at the table on this. They are not sort of categorically opposed to these ideas and initiatives. They are doing them already in other parts of the world, and I think want to see more innovative recycling programs. They want to see recycling programs do better so that more types of products can be recycled. And they recognize that local governments just aren't going to get there right now on their own. We don't have the funds, we don't have the money. And so if it means, when I've talked to Ameripen, they are very interested in seeing, if their money comes into Maryland to do this work, they want to make sure that some of that money can help local governments innovate and build out better systems to recycle more products.
Okay, what are the, I know what I was going to say here. Sorry, I missed this question. Somebody wants to know, in the upcoming session, Delegate Lierman, what legislators are the champions besides those on screen, and what committees will this go before?
I believe that this is going to ENT and ECM. And there are lots of amazing champions on in the House of Delegates on environmental issues. So I'm not going to start naming names because I'm going to forget them all. But you know, we have there are so many around the state who are working to build a cleaner Maryland. And so, I mean, it's certainly, you know, the people on this call are awesome. You know, we all work really hard and we work together, but there are many, many, many other people who are not on this call who are doing amazing work. So but I can't, I can't sort of name all of them. You could download the Maryland League of Conservation Voters voter guide or report card from last year to see, you know, some of who's doing what.
Okay, great. Well, in fact, there are several EPR type bills before the legislature this year, right? There's Delegate Love's bottle bill.
And then
Delegate
paint care.
Paint care, yes,
Yep.
exactly. And I believe there's one on artificial turf playing fields coming up.
Yep.
So I may have missed one too also, but is there a list somewhere of the other states working on similar EPR bills?
Central repository for a list, I would check out the Product Stewardship Institute's website. They probably are listing every single state, although off the top of my head, I know that this upcoming session, Maryland is joined by Massachusetts, Maine, potentially Vermont, Washington, Oregon,
New York,
thank you.
Maybe California.
Maybe California, although California is in this very strange position. They're doing like all different kinds of interesting packaging and plastics policies and proposals that are happening in fits and starts. There are advocates out there that have that under control.
Is the goal of the Maryland bill, Delegate Lierman, to eco-modulate or provide income to municipalities?
What does eco-modulate mean?
So that's just the incentive structure for the fees.
Oh, I see. Sorry. So it's both. I mean, it's a both and. It is both to encourage better design, more sustainable design, and it is to get money to local governments. They're not mutually exclusive goals. So it's both.
And how do you recommend that we engage to promote or encourage the passing of this legislation?
Reach out to me or to Martha and the Sierra Club and get involved. We'll definitely need, you know, testimony and support. We'll want you to reach out to your delegates and your senators to let them know that this is a bill and a concept that you support and that you want them to be involved. You can also reach out, I'd say, to your local governments. We'd love to see MACO and the local governments come to the table, since this is a bill that will ultimately benefit them and help, you know, provide funding to them. So it's really important to us that local governments get engaged as well.
Great. There's one question in here. I don't know if the premise it's based on is correct, so you guys can figure it out. To be clear, the person says this only impacts Maryland producers. Is there a similar bill in the works to impact anything that is sold in Maryland? Or is
this doesn't just impact Maryland producers.
Right.
This impacts anything that's imported into the state as well. So you cannot import or sell in the state something that's made elsewhere but is sold here.
Right. And where can we go to see the top line economic data about EPR and its savings for local governments?
That's a really good question. I was thinking where best to direct people. Again, I think PSI, the Product Stewardship Institute, has some good information. The other that I would recognize, and I can put a link in the chat, is the central, I'm not even sure exactly what their role is per se in Canada, because each province has their own PRO, but there's a central repository data center in Canada that collects information and advises both the provincial governments and the federal government on EPR for packaging and other EPR programs. So I can put a link in the chat to their website, and I would imagine there's some good economic data on there. In terms of savings here in the US, I mean, it's all anecdotal so far because we don't have any laws that have been passed, but all of these bills would cover the cost to collect and process and transport all recyclable material. Maines even provides a reimbursement for packaging that is disposed through municipal programs. So there's a slight reimbursement for disposal as well. So if you just do a back of the envelope calculation of what your annual recycling costs and packaging waste costs are harder to calculate. But if you do a back of the envelope calculation of your recycling costs under any of these programs, those would be reimbursed and covered.
Okay, thanks. I believe that Delegate Mary Lehman has a question. Mary, can you unmute and activate your video?
Yes. Yeah, thank you. So my question was going to be around how useful is it, and this could be for John or Brooke, how useful is it to be prescriptive about how you want to see producers ultimately dispose of, recycle, repurpose these materials? Because I found with my synthetic artificial turf bill that I'll be bringing back in some form for the third year, that there was, the first year the problem was with us trying to prescribe that that it should go to, we sort of mischaracterized, some people would say it was accurate, but the first year we characterized synthetic turf because of the crumb rubber infill as hazardous waste. MDE waited till about 2 days before my hearing to say, in fact, we don't have any hazardous waste landfills in the state of Maryland, and you would therefore be forcing producers, manufacturers to send it out of state, and then EPA guidelines would kick in. You don't want to do that. And I really didn't intend to do that. But then last year, when I shifted to an EPR model, there was still the pushback from the turf industry saying, we're trying to figure this out for ourselves. We're not ready. They didn't want to say they didn't want to tell people where this stuff was going, but they didn't. I mean, and they claimed they really couldn't because it was sort of this work in progress. They were doing their best to recycle and repurpose and reuse, but that wasn't always the case. So does it help to be prescriptive, or is it more about, I guess, transparency around the whole process and reduction on the front end, as Brooke said, trying to shift away from coming up with new and different, packages for all these things? Which is it?
So, sorry, I don't know if I totally followed the question. Which we're
Either,
trying to get I understand the concern with the turf. Can you say again what the question is about?
Yeah, so bill? I guess two parts, and I'm sorry, it was a long question.
No, it's okay.
But should EPR laws be prescriptive about, the end of this product's, the life, right, where it goes, how specific you are about the so-called solution,
right.
And then what was the other part of it?
Well, I can answer that part. I'll
right.
just say, I think it's really different for packaging bills than it is for something that's a single product, like a turf
right.
field or a paint can, right? Because an EPR for packaging covers such a huge range of different types of packaging. It's everything from like the plastic container that my kids' applesauce came in, to some Amazon packaging, to, the container that your lettuce comes in, or that my son's Beyblades came in, right? Like there's so many different types of packaging. So it's hard to be really prescriptive about, because it's just each type is a little bit different, and they're made from different kinds of plastics, it's, what your detergent comes in, or there's
right.
just so many. So I don't think you can be very prescriptive about each type, the end life of each single type. I think you have to be a little bit more general about, in general, the products you create should have, be from, post content or post-user content recycling levels, and should be designed in a way that they are more easily or more readily recyclable, right? Not like 5 different kinds of plastic in one bottle. That means that it's never going to be recyclable, or you'd have to take it all apart and recycle at different places. So I think you could put in the plan that's created, the stewardship plan can have sort of that level of specificity, but not, I don't think, the level of specificity that it would for a single type of item. Does that make sense?
Yes, definitely. And I guess my other question was the front end part of it, where you emphasized, having producers work on just less packaging to begin with. How important is that piece?
Yeah, I mean, I think Delegate Lierman hit the nail on the head. I mean, the way I see it, it's really, you know, sort of those bowling bumpers that I was talking about. It's about preventing through the definition of recycling what we don't want to see, principally in the packaging space. And I can say this as an environmental advocate, and I know that Sierra Club is taking a similar position. You know, we look at something like chemical recycling as a false solution to this problem. Chemical recycling is a way to take plastic and theoretically break it down into its elements and then reform it into plastic. But what winds up happening is it all becomes diesel fuel because there's a strong economic incentive from the fossil fuel oil and gas industry to continue producing virgin plastic. So we're really pushing back as much as we can on chemical recycling as not a form of recycling. And then beyond that, in terms of being not too overly prescriptive, the hope is to encourage on the positive side that which we want to see. So if we want to see more reduction, if we want to see more reuse put forward, then we're going to incentivize those through reducing fees, or better yet, you know, if a company is willing to set up a reuse system, maybe they get exempted completely from the program. They're able to do their own reuse program on the side, and they don't even participate in the EPR program because they're not putting packaging onto the market. And just to once again reiterate what Delegate Lierman said about minimum recycled content standards, again, that's a way to require a way to stimulate the market. You know, if you've got material that could be hypothetically used in new packaging and you're requiring that producers use 25% recycled content in their packaging, well, there's nowhere else for it to go other than the heavy demand you've now created in the production end of the system for that recycled material.
Great, thank you so much. This is an excellent forum. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, thank you. We're just about ready to close down. We've been up an hour, but I noticed that Councilman Hagan has been trying to break through to ask a question, and so I'd like to invite him to unmute.
I was just wondering if there was any single source or multiple sources where good examples have been compiled of significant changes in actual products, you know, from large scale things like automobiles. Heard stories about some changes in the plastics that might be used in certain cars in Germany or whatever, make it more recyclable, less toxic, you know, whatever. But it would be really great to be able to pull out a number of different examples sort of across the spectrum of different product types that where those sorts of changes have happened because of extended product producer responsibility. Did that?
You're breaking up again. Go ahead, John.
Well, I think I've got it, and thanks for the great question. I think, you know, data is top of line, and I see in the chat that there's a request for the economic data link from Canada. I'll get to that in just a second too, hopefully before we sign off. I would recommend looking. First place that comes to mind is the French PRO website. It might require some Google Translate, or just usually there's that little button in the top right corner that says translate this page for me. The French PRO is called Citeo, C-I-T-E-O. I know that they have some good data on their eco-modulated fee structure and how that started to impact what is being sold on the market there. Another great fount of information in the US, I would need to follow up with him and see what he's got on top of mind right now, but Victor Bell runs an organization out of Rhode Island that does international consulting with companies who are participating in EPR programs, and he's been tracking very closely eco-modulation as it's been rolled out and has been keeping tabs on how materials have changed. In fact, I have a presentation that he gave in Maine in January of last year that does include, it's not, you know, full data tables, but it is some anecdotal evidence that he's compiled for a slideshow that does start to show how product design has shifted a bit. So I'm happy to share that as well after the fact. Martha, I don't know if it would be better for me to quickly try and scramble and see if I can get those in the chat, or if it would be best to have those sent out through an email, but happy to do either.
Email would be great, and thank you very much.
Let's do the email. There are a lot more questions, and our time is up, and I know people have other appointments. So what I'd like to suggest is that we will get back to you for the questions that were not answered. We are saving them in the chat and the Q&A, and we'll get back to you. And I wanted to thank you all for the excellent questions and the excellent presentations from John Hite and Delegate Brooke Lierman. And we're really pleased with the attendance at this. Actually, several delegates who didn't even register showed up and we didn't know it. So Delegate Bagnall and Delegate Lierman and any others, I have to look through the list of attendees, but it's thank you very much, everyone. And it's a difficult thing to get your head around, but I think you all gave really clear explanations, and we will probably have this up on the Sierra Club website by the weekend for anyone who missed it. So thank you all, and Happy New Year.
Thanks. Happy New Year, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Take care.